Breaking Major League Baseball news, Commissioner Rob Manfred has removed Pete Rose, Shoeless Joe Jackson, and other deceased players from the permanently ineligible list. The decision ends the ban that Rose accepted back in 1989 following an investigation that determined he bet on games while managing the Reds. Jackson and 7 other Chicago White Sox were banned in 1921 for fixing the 1919 World Series. Manfred ruling that the MLB's punishment of banned individuals should end upon their deaths. Based on current rules, the earliest they could be enshrined into the Hall of Fame is the summer of 28. That's 3 years from now. Pete Rose died in September of last year and even predicted that this might happen upon his death. He said he nor his family would appreciate or care about being inducted into the Hall of Fame. All right, we have a couple of great baseball minds joining us now, David Samson and Jim Bowden. Jim, what more can you tell us about this decision to basically open the door for deceased players who had been ruled ineligible to get into the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, so it started in January when Pete Rose's family put a petition together to the commissioner hoping to get him off the ineligible list. That's how it started. And then President Trump had a meeting with Commissioner Manfred and also encouraged him to do the same. And so the commissioner has been looking at this issue very thoroughly and came to the conclusion that there is no reason why a player on the ineligible list that passes away, there's no reason they have to stay on the list since they can no longer be a threat to the integrity of Major League Baseball. So the whole process started by kind of a push from Pete Rose's family. It then was pushed from the White House. And at the end of the day, you know, look, I think this decision for Commissioner Manfred makes sense. I think he, you know, found a way to do it without exonerating Pete Rose and rather just telling every player that passes away no longer is on the ineligible list. And yes, it now does open the door for a Veterans Committee to perhaps consider Pete Rose into the Hall of Fame.
Time is interesting, David, because Rose, I mean, it hasn't even been a year since he passed away. What do you think of this?
Yeah, this is not a coincidence because the Pete Rose issue has been one that has been in front of the commissioners ever since the ban. And Bud Selig was always clear in owners' meetings that he was not going to go against what Bart Giamatti had ruled and what the evidence had said. And as a matter of fact, when Bart Giamatti passed away so soon after, it became sort of a mantra for Commissioner Selig, I'm not going to do anything here. But Pete Rose has obviously lobbied to become eligible for the Hall of Fame throughout his life, though he did not do himself any favors in terms of remorse and other things that he did. But what's happened now, and the timing again is not a coincidence, is that the meeting that the commissioner had with President Trump in the White House was a pretty telling meeting, given that there's a lot of fish to fry for Major League Baseball in Washington right now. There's a lot of tax issues that are being considered that would impact owners. There's that old antitrust exemption. And if President Trump says that he would like Pete Rose to be, that he'd like to pardon him, which he can't pardon him into the Hall of Fame, but then he said he should be in the Hall of Fame, this is a way for the commissioner to actually give President Trump something in order to get something back on behalf of owners. And he's not doing it just for Pete, so he's got cover with Bud and the memory of Bart Giamatti to say, hey, if you've croaked, you're off the list. Which makes sense because it's true, no more issues of integrity because you're dead. And so, again, Pete Rose is not in the Hall of Fame today. That's not the announcement. He is able to now be considered by an era committee, which would be early as 2028, for an induction. But Jim, I would tell you that I would bet you $1 that Pete Rose will not be inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2028.
Yeah, I'd agree with you completely, David. You know, I think he kind of falls in the same category as Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and the PED players. You know, I think the fact that he was ruled ineligible for betting on baseball and the integrity of the game, I do not see the voters, I do not see the New Era group, the Veterans Committee. I can't see anybody getting together and putting him in the Hall of Fame. but I think at least taking him off the list can be a relief to the Rose family, and the fact that he can be considered at least for the Hall of Fame. But I'm with you. I find it highly unlikely that not only does he not get in 2028, I think it's highly unlikely he ever gets into the Hall of Fame.
We do have a statement from the Hall of Fame. I'm just going to read part of it. Major League Baseball's decision to remove deceased individuals from the permanently ineligible list will allow the Hall of Fame candidacy of such individuals to now be considered. The Historical Overview Committee will develop the ballot of 8 names for the Classic Baseball Era Committee, which evaluates candidates who made their greatest impact on the game prior to 1980 to vote on when it next meets in December of 27. So you guys don't think Pete Rose is going to be voted into the Hall of Fame when he gets a chance to in 27 or 28. Do you think any of these other deceased individuals might, like a Shoeless Joe Jackson?
So my view on that is that there's a big decision first, and baseball gets to say it's not me. But in fact, when you look at the makeup of the committees, it's very much under the purview of Major League Baseball. The big question that we'll get to talk about a lot on CBS Sports HQ is, will Pete Rose and Shoeless Joe Jackson even be 2 of the 8 people considered by the committee? And I would tell you that I would expect him not to be on the first list of eligible players that year. I think he will have to wait to even appear on that final list, which doesn't give you induction. It just means you can be considered. I don't think he's on the first list in December of 27.
What do you think, Jim?
Yeah, look, I think he probably will be considered, but as I said, I don't think he's getting in. Look, you know, the one thing about the Hall of Fame, it's not a museum, right? If it's a museum, the greatest players in baseball would be in with all the stories around them. Barry Bonds is the greatest player I ever saw with my eyeballs. He's not in the Hall of Fame. Roger Clemens was one of the best pitchers I ever saw. He's not in the Hall of Fame. And there's several other players, PED, Sammy Sosa, Alex Rodriguez. There's so many other players that, quite frankly, aren't getting in because of how they treated the game of baseball. And betting on baseball while playing or managing is something that I find it very difficult. If the group doesn't want to let in certain players that have a PED, a cloud around them, I can't imagine them voting in someone that was found and admitted and confessed to betting on baseball. So that's just my view on it. But, you know, I am glad they kind of tweaked this, and I think David Samson really nailed it when he said the commissioner had to do something with the pressure of the White House with so many issues. They've always tried to, you know, protect the antitrust exemption, and they certainly do care about not crossing up the White House, who has a lot of power for a lot of things these owners are trying to do. So I think this move actually makes a lot of sense.
And I think, Jim, you said something really important, which is the PD and is one thing, betting on baseball is another. However, Pete Rose is in the museum. When we say getting into the Hall of Fame, that's code for being in the plaque room and having a plaque. But in the museum, although you can go to the memorabilia store next door and where Pete used to sign autographs saying that he's sorry he bet on baseball, but there is mention of players who do have that cloud of suspicion over them with PEDs, and it's not as though that Pete Rose has been wiped from the history of baseball. But when we talk about not being in the Hall of Fame, we're talking about not being in the plaque room.
I think a lot of people are going to see this headline today, and they're just going to assume that, well, that's it. Pete Rose is going to get into the Hall of Fame. You guys don't think that's going to happen. I want to ask you this, though. 2 totally different things. Let's just say Barry Bonds. Jim, you said he's the best player you ever saw firsthand. Who has a better chance of getting into the Hall of Fame eventually, Barry Bonds or Pete Rose?
I would say neither one. I mean, you know, a lot of time has passed on both. I don't personally see the pathway. Now, you don't know 20 years from now or 30 years from now what that group of writers are going to think and if they're going to change their minds. But, you know, we've been watching very closely all these people voting in PEDs, and, you know, the Bonds and the Clemens and the Sosas, they never get close. I mean, they never got any traction whatsoever. And I just don't think that, I think Cooperstown, the makeup and character and how you carried yourself in your career is a major factor, and it's going to count. So I don't think either one's going to get in myself.
And once the 10 years passes, it's in the hand of these committees. And so I would say that, Jim, I completely agree. But if you're asking me to say who has the better chance, I would say Bonds, because PEDs are one thing, but gambling on baseball, especially given the amount of business that all the leagues do with gambling companies, where you need to protect the integrity. The third rail is far more gambling now than it is PEDs. But I would say they're both tied for 0. But if you're forcing me to make a choice, I would say Barry Bonds has a better chance to get 0.0001 than Pete Rose.
The Mavs had a 1.8% chance of winning the lottery last night, and they got it. But 0.0 is a lot less than 1.8. David, Jim, thank you so much on this day that Commissioner Manfred says Pete Rose has been removed from Major League Baseball's permanently ineligible list. So he could be voted into the Hall of Fame, but neither one of our front office guys thinks that that's actually going to happen. Breaking news from Major League Baseball, Commissioner Rob Manfred removing Pete Rose, Shoeless Joe Jackson, and other deceased players from the permanently ineligible list. The decision ends the ban that Rose accepted back in 1989 following an investigation into that he determined that he bet on games while managing the Reds. Manfred ruled that Major League Baseball's punishment of banned individuals should end upon their deaths, and Rose died in September of last year. We hear from then Commissioner Bart Giamatti on August 1989.
The banishment for life of Pete Rose from baseball is the sad end of a sorry episode. One of the game's greatest players has engaged in a variety of acts which have stained the game, and he must now live with the consequences of those acts. By choosing not to come to a hearing before me, and by choosing not to proffer any testimony or evidence contrary to the evidence and information contained in the report of the Special Counsel to the Commissioner, Mr. Rose has accepted baseball's ultimate sanction, which is lifetime ineligibility.
Hey, there you heard it, lifetime ineligibility, and Pete Rose's life is now over. Interesting timing here. It kind of makes sense because he passed away September of last year. Matt Snyder, who has a Hall of Fame vote, is joining us now on HQ, our CBS Sports baseball writer. Matt, this is different than just regular voting for the Hall of Fame. Can you walk us through this process of how Pete Rose could get into the Hall of Fame now?
Yeah, it's the BBWA ballot. That's where I'm a voter. It is generally for players who have been retired for 5 years, and then they're eligible to be on the ballot for up to 10 years. So retired between 5 and 15 years usually is when the player comes on the ballot, and he can hang around. If he gets more than 5% of the vote, he's in the Hall of Fame. If he gets 75% of the vote, obviously, Pete's been retired for a lot longer than that. He never was on the BBWA ballot, though, so maybe they'll throw him on that ballot. I'm inclined to think that he'll go through a Veterans Committee or even some kind of special committee, in which case I would not be a voter. The Veterans Committees are generally a 16-person panel, a mixture of current Hall of Famers, executives. They'll usually have 1 or 2 media people on that board, and big-time, like long-time media people, like a Bob Costas type. Somebody would be on that type of panel, and those meet at the winter meetings every year. I'm inclined to think, as I said, that he'll be on some kind of Veterans Committee, or maybe they'll even have a special committee for this entire group of players. But it's possible to throw him on the BBWA ballot as well, because he's never been on that ballot before, and usually the committee vote is for players who did not make it in via the BBWA vote and lapsed off of that ballot.
We spoke with David Samson and Jim Bowden, who were both successful in front offices over the years in Major League Baseball. Both of them said that they did not think Pete Rose would get into the Hall of Fame this way, that they don't think he'd ever get into the Hall of Fame because of what he did. If you are on one of those committees, if you are a voter, how are you going about deciding whether or not to put him in?
That's a tough call because for me, he absolutely stayed in the game. I think gambling on the game and the possibility that a game is fixed, it could be something that ruins a sport. And that's the fallout of the Black Sox scandal. They had to put these rules in place. He knowingly violated these rules and all that stuff. And I know that there are a lot of people who want PED users, such as, or people who weren't even caught and suspended by the system, but people who were suspected to use or admitted it, such as Barry Bonds and Mark McGwire. They're not in. I know a lot of people don't want those guys in. In my opinion, the gambling on baseball is a bigger deal than PEDs. But the other part of me is I've always said that I don't want to be a guy who keeps somebody out in spite of what the fans want. And if I got the feeling that 75% of the fans out there, which obviously there's no great way to measure this, but if so many fans want him in the Hall of Fame, I don't view myself as somebody who thinks I'm so big that I'm going to go against public opinion. And maybe it looks like I'm spineless or weak-willed or whatever, but I kind of feel like if the overwhelming majority of fans want Pete Rose in, then I would just bite the bullet and vote him in, even though personally I don't think he should be in because of what he did.
Quite the coincidence tonight that the Reds are playing the White Sox, right?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And the White Sox are part of this with the whole Black Sox scandal. And now Shoeless Joe Jackson and others can be voted in. How do you, or do you, separate the two? What Pete Rose did compared to what Shoeless Joe and those other Black Sox players did?
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously throwing the World Series is a much, much bigger deal than Pete Rose because there was never evidence that Rose actively threw games, obviously. And the whole reason that those rules were put in place for Pete Rose, it was because of the Black Sox scandal. You know, they had to bring in Judge Landis to become the commissioner, put down this punishment, put rules in place that kind of made sure that this would never, ever, ever happen again to where players were tempted to or actually threw a World Series. So that's a way bigger deal. If we're going to go at this from a moral standpoint, the White Sox players absolutely committed a much bigger sin than Pete Rose. It'll be interesting to see because if we go on just on-field cases, obviously Pete's open and shut. He's easily in. Shoeless Joe Jackson, again, if you look at just the on-field performance, he should be in the Hall of Fame. So it's going to be interesting to see how this is sorted out. And if we're just saying we're going to wipe the slate clean and we're just going to judge on-field, or if we're going to get into degrees of how big of a crime was this. And if we get into the degrees there, the White Sox crime was a lot bigger than Pete Rose's. All
right, Matt Snyder, who has a Hall of Fame vote, joining us here on CBS Sports HQ as Pete Rose is now eligible to go into the Hall of Fame. The Cincinnati Reds, who Pete Rose played for and managed, released the following statement. On behalf of the Reds and our generations of loyal fans, we're thankful for the decision of Commissioner Manfred in Major League Baseball regarding the removal of Pete Rose from the permanently ineligible list. Pete is one of the greatest players in baseball history, and Reds country will continue to celebrate him as we always have. We are especially happy for the Rose family to receive this news and what this decision could mean for them and all of Pete's fans.